Before we begin and I introduce our guest speakers for today, I would like to share some housekeeping rules. So this entire session is recorded and will be uploaded on our YouTube channel, so which you can access later and share the link with interested friends, colleagues who could not join us today. We request all of you to please keep your mics off until the end of the session. We will have a Q&A session right after the end of the presentation by our guest speakers. So until then, please feel free to use our chat box for your comments, suggestions, and questions, and we will make sure to address them in the end. So during the Q&A session, we will ask you to raise your hands to ask your questions, and we will ask you to unmute and interact with our speakers. For this session, I would also like to acknowledge the presence of our NGO partners of our Civil Society Academy program who are attending the session. So thank you all for joining us today. We have Vanisha, my colleague from Climate Asia, will be helping us with an overview of this discussion in Hindi. So she will be helping us with that. So we hope that this masterclass will be an interesting and informative session for all of you. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our two very special guest speakers from Thousand Currents, Ms. Luam Kidane and Ms. Ashlesha Khadse. To give you a background of them, Luam is the Vice President Global Programs at Thousand Currents. Her extensive works explores research, writing, curatorial work, which examines movement building at the intersection of indigenous governance models, cultural productions, and articulations of self-determination. Prior to joining Thousand Currents, Luam worked as a researcher and strategist on food sovereignty, political economy, gender, sexuality, climate justice, and cultural production. Ashlesha, who is our second speaker, is the Regional Director, Asia and the Pacific at Thousand Currents. She wears many hats as an activist, researcher, and a philanthropy sector professional. Her background is in learning from and supporting Indian and global farmers movements like La Via Campesina for more than 10 years. She currently volunteers with a variety of Indian people's movements working towards just food system. Her research work centers on agroecology, peasant movements, gender, and land rights. So thank you so much, Luam and Ashlesha, for joining us and making time to host this very interesting and pertinent masterclass on climate justice. We hope to get an overview of what climate justice really is. I think we saw in that word cloud, what is it? So yeah, we are hearing to hear from you. So over to you to take this ahead.
Thank you, Mayun, and thank you for having both Ashlesha and myself here today. We're looking forward to doing this session and being in conversation with you all later today, later on in the hour as well. So in terms of how we're gonna do this beginning part of the presentation, I'll start with a general overview of how we understand climate justice at Thousand Currents and how that then infuses into our work. And then Ashlesha will give us some examples of the partners that we fund in Asia and the Pacific who are advancing different solutions. And then we'll switch into a little bit around climate financing. What is it? What are some of the trends we're seeing before we end again with a few examples of the partners that we're supporting that are really forwarding just climate solutions. So there are many components to climate justice and what a climate justice approach is. While what I'm going to be saying in the next little bit is not an exhaustive list, I'd like to offer a few characteristics to help you get a sense of what we mean when we say climate justice. So firstly, climate justice connects the climate crisis to not only environmental issues, but also to economic, political, cultural, and social issues as well. It acknowledges that communities in the global South face the worst impacts of the climate crisis while being the least responsible for historical emissions. Research shows that developed countries are responsible for nearly 80% of cumulative global carbon emissions from 1850 to 2011. It also holds true that despite which community you're from, what region of the world you live in, or what your economic situation is, that we all have a right to live a life with dignity that includes access to and stewardship of a livable planet. In this sense, advocates of climate justice don't only focus on reducing emissions as the solve for the climate crisis, but also for transformation in all of the ways our societies function. This is called systems change by some activists and movements. The framing also acknowledges that if we want sustainable solutions to the climate crisis, then they have to be built using a bottom-up approach. What this means is that Indigenous, Black, Afro-descendant, and caste-oppressed peoples are the ones that do the most to protect the environment. For example, though Indigenous peoples comprise just 5% of the global population, they protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. It also means that Indigenous, Black, Afro-descendant, and caste-oppressed peoples hold the interconnected knowledges, the intersectional practices, and proven solutions that we need to address the climate crisis. For these reasons, these communities need to be leading and setting the agenda for what climate solutions we need. Finally, a climate justice approach is also clear that false solutions will not address the climate crisis. What are false solutions? A great resource called Hoodwinked in the Hothouse defines them this way. Quote, false solutions are climate strategies that may be premised on addressing climate change, but in practice do not meaningfully contribute to long-term emissions reductions, are unsustainable in the long term, violate the principles of environmental justice, perpetuate harm to communities or create new harms, and avoid the underlying drivers of the climate crisis, end quote. And I'll be sharing in the link some of the resources that I'm either quoting or referencing so that you can do some follow-up and reading and research on your own as well. And so to ground what a false solution is in a quick example, let's use agriculture. And I'm using agriculture because it's still often left out of the climate conversation when it's really an integral part of the conversation. So 70% of people depend on the peasant food web, which uses less than 25% of agricultural land, while 30% depend on the industrial food chain, which uses more than 75% of agricultural land and also accounts for at least 90% of agriculture's fossil fuel use, according to research by the ETC group. One of agribusiness's responses to the climate crisis is something called climate smart agriculture. I'm sure you've all heard of it. It's a false solution type of farming which monitors fields to mine for data that then would be used for, as researcher Gopal Dayani describes it, quote, farmer-led crop selection for varieties more tolerant to climate shocks, but also it's used to embrace genetic engineering, corporate ownership of seed, and monocropping with overuse of fertilizers to maximize yield, end quote. Not only are a lot of the technologies used in climate smart agriculture not able to regain in climate benefits the energy and resource inputs it needs, it also further concentrates corporate power to the detriment of peasant farmers. On the other hand, we have agroecology, which is one, a bottom-up farming practice led by peasants, which uses sustainable ecological farming practices that are place-specific. Two, that has the possibility to reduce 490 gigatons of CO2 emissions by 2050. And three, is part of the food sovereignty movement, which calls for an ecological transformation of the politics, economics, and social systems that underpin the way people and communities grow, distribute, and also consume food. A climate justice approach champions agroecology because it is a grassroots climate solution. And you'll be hearing in more detail some examples of this when Ashlesha talks to you about some of the partners. But first, what is a grassroots climate solution? To get to that, we can look to a report recently released by Klima. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Klima, Thousand Currents is a part of a climate funding collaborative called Klima, which includes Global Green Grants, Grassroots International, and also Urgent Action Fund for Feminist Activism. In this report called Soil to Sky, Solutions to Transform, we define grassroots climate solutions as democratized, dispersed, decentralized, and interconnected, resulting from collective and direct action that create targeted pressure and alternatives and are born out of their respective communities. This is important because people-based solutions are essential to achieving an equitable, cleaner, and cooler world and provide cross-cutting benefits, for example, racial, social justice, gender equity, public health, and Indigenous sovereignty. And this is important because it addresses systemic challenges and also improves conditions for everyone. So what does this look like for practice at Thousand Currents? In the global team, our strategy sets out that we support movement-led work, which addresses issues of climate change, for example, like movement-led initiatives geared at keeping the rise in global temperatures at or below 1.5 degrees, and the institution of community-owned renewable energies, while at the same time, paraphrasing from an allied organization called War on Want, also ensures that what is being built and advocated for allows us to thrive within planetary boundaries, that historical and also contemporary systems and practices of oppression, exploitation, and extraction are addressed and resolved, and finally, that everyone has a dignified life. So I'll pause there so that you can do the interpretation, Venetia, and then send it to Ashlesha.
Yes, thank you. So लुआम ने कहा कि क्लाइमेट जस्टिस की जब हम बात करते हैं तो हम इसको होलिस्टिक अप्रोच में देखते हैं, होलिस्टिक दृष्टिकोण में, जिसमें एनवायरनमेंट, इकोलॉजी, पॉलिटिक्स, कल्चरल, सोशल सब तरह के वेलबींग के बारे में बात किया जाता है। और इनका कहना ये भी है कि हमारी इकोनॉमिक या पॉलिटिकल सिचुएशन कैसी भी हो, हम सबका हक है इस संसार में कि हम एक इक्विटेबल तरीके से रहें और एक सुरक्षित संसार में रहें। अब हिस्टोरिकली देखा जाए तो डेवलप्ड वर्ल्ड ज्यादा रेस्पॉन्सिबल है कार्बन एमिशंस के लिए, लेकिन क्लाइमेट जस्टिस बात करता है कि हम कैसे इस पूरे अप्रोच को बदलें जिससे कि हम रीबिल्ड करें और बॉटम अप अप्रोच अपनाएं, जिससे कि समुदाय के लोग इसका ओनरशिप लें, वो बताएं कि किस तरह की समस्या के लिए कौन से संसाधन की जरूरत है और किस तरह के सॉल्यूशंस की जरूरत है। इसमें उन्होंने कई उदाहरण दिए, जिसमें उन्होंने एक एग्रीकल्चर का उदाहरण दिया कि हम एग्रो इकोलॉजी की बात करते हैं। एक तरफ जहाँ पे बड़े बड़े कॉरपोरेट्स इस पूरे एग्रीकल्चर के बिजनेस को चला रहे हैं, जिसमें हाइब्रिड और फर्टिलाइजर का यूज करके और हम ज्यादा प्रोडक्टिविटी कर रहे हैं हमारे धरती को नुकसान पहुंचाकर। दूसरी तरफ एग्रो इकोलॉजी है जो कि बात करता है कि कैसे पेजेंट्स या लैंडलेस फार्मर्स वो सारे एकत्रित होके और कुछ ऐसे सॉल्यूशंस ला सकते हैं जो कि ना सिर्फ हमारी धरती के लिए अच्छा होगा बल्कि हमारे स्वास्थ्य के लिए भी, हमारे समाज के लिए भी। तो इस तरह की पॉलिसीज कैसे अपनाई जाए जो एक सिस्टमिक अप्रोच दर्शाता हो और ये हम सबके लिए एक इक्विटेबल, क्लीनर और एक कूलर एनवायरनमेंट बनाए। Thank you. Over to Ashlesha.
Thank you. And I would like to ask Purnima to play the slide. Thank you so much. And also namaste to all our Hindi speakers. I'm going to give you some examples now to show you like what climate justice actually looks like, and I want to show you some examples which come from different kinds of angles and spaces and perspectives, so you can see how it applies to different contexts. So the first example I want to show you is from Nepal, and this is an example related to conservation and forests. So oftentimes, you know, when we think of conservation, who are we thinking about? We in our heads might think of a national park, we might think of a protected area. These are all usually controlled and owned by the governments. But the reality is, and I think my colleague Luam had also shared a statistic, that it is the indigenous people, the Adivasi peoples, who are the ones who are mainly conserving the forest. So if you look at the global figures, 50% of the global landmass is actually governed and conserved by forests. So this whole idea of community forest, community conservation is very, very important. Now, this example is from FECOFON. This is a organization which is our partner, and it is a federation of forest user groups. Now, a very interesting thing in Nepal is that the government has identified and agreed that indigenous communities, they should have control and they should manage the forest to some extent, not all forests, some forests. And if you notice that in India, we also have the Forest Rights Act. So all these acts came about after a lot of, you know, struggle by social movements who basically said that Adivasis should have control over their rights. And it's very, very important. So similarly, in Nepal, the government agrees that community forestry should increase. And at the grassroots level, they have something called forest user groups. So these are small, groups or sangatans, as we say in Hindi, small groups of 10 people, 10 to 15 people. Each of them has a little piece of forest, and they govern it, they manage it sustainably, and they also use it for their livelihood. But they are not extracting it, destroying it, and felling it. And here's the result, what happened. When they started community forestry, forests have expanded in Nepal. 5% forests have actually increased, and deforestation has gone down. So what does this show us? That communities, when they are in charge of forests, when they are given the land rights, they actually conserve and expand forests and protect the environment and engage in climate mitigation. So today, FECOFON has something like 8 million members in Nepal. And they've had, aside from the ecological gains, there have been so many incredible social kinds of positive effects. For example, women. In FECOFON, the community groups, women have to be in leadership. They have a rule. A lot of women have joined the user groups. They are engaging in day-to-day decision-making. And in 2017, when Nepal had its first election, 600 women members of FECOFON, they actually won local elections. So this is a really good example of climate justice. And just to reiterate, what is the climate justice angle in this case? It is that forests are being conserved, mitigation is taking place, but at the same time, the land rights of indigenous peoples and forest communities are being advanced. So that's my first example. Now I request you to change the slide, Purnima, please. Thank you. Now, this is an example of gender and climate justice. And this is an example which is coming from Fiji, from Pacific. Now, you may be wondering, what does gender and sexuality have to do with climate justice? But through this example, I hope to show you why they are both linked and why they should be at the center of our thinking when we are talking about climate justice. So Fiji, as you know, is an island nation, and it's going to be heavily, and it is already being impacted by climate change. There's sea level rise going on. You know that island nations might not even exist if the sea level continues to rise at the rate that it is. And they are constantly facing all kinds of climate problems. There's so many cyclones, hurricanes. So they are the frontline communities. But the gender aspect here, that Fiji is also very patriarchal and Christian country. It's quite conservative. And so homophobia and transphobia is very, very common here. And women's rights are also quite poor. So if you see about women don't have very high livelihood opportunities. They are doing all the care work. You must have heard about unpaid care burden. Women are the ones who are sitting at home, taking care of all the care, the cooking, the cleaning, but they are not paid. So they don't have livelihood opportunities, which will actually give them incomes. And if you see the statistics, 62% of gender non-conforming people in Fiji, they have no jobs, they are unemployed, or they are employed in precarious work. So what does that mean? That could look like, unregulated work like sex work. Okay, so it's not always safe. And most of them don't have jobs. And so you can see that the communities are frontline communities, but even within that community, women are more disadvantaged. And even within the women, the gender non-conforming, non-binary women are even more marginalized. So they don't have access to housing. They don't have access always to sanitation, safety, security. During the pandemic, we saw the case where so many gender non-conforming people were facing violence. So these kind of problems are already faced by such people. Now, the group in question here is called Diva for Equality. It's an amazing and unique feminist collective of LBT women, non-binary women, and they are a membership-based organization and all across the rural areas and maritime areas of Fiji, because it's an island nation, so the islands are very far away. And it's the only peer kind of network that exists in the region for their members who are gender non-conforming women. And the example I want to show you is that photo. You can see the women are building. So what Diva did is they started a women builders program. One of the things, as I said, women don't have livelihoods, gender non-conforming women in particular. And so they created a program to train them in construction. And the construction industry also in Fiji is completely male, men-led. In fact, they don't even have toilets for women. So you can see how structurally the women are sidelined. And so they created different cohorts of such women who received training, and they received advanced training. So not only did they become builders, now have certifications. It was a lengthy program, and they provided them all the support. What kind of support will they provide so that they can have this kind of training? They provided them with childcare, for example. We know that women can't access these kinds of programs because they have children to take care of. So they provided childcare, etc. These are the things, when you have a feminist approach, when you have an intersectional approach, you take note of all of these types of things in support that has to be provided to members. So as a result of this program, now there's a women builders group who are certified builders, and they have been going into the communities. They have been repairing bathrooms. They have been creating housing, safe houses. Frontline communities, they've been losing, infrastructure. Bridges were being washed out after the climate. If there was a storm, if there was a hurricane, and it's not always, the governments will not respond so quickly because they have so many other things to do. It's not always their priority. So it is the frontline communities and movements like Diva who have responded. They have built all these different bridges. So one more example, here what we're trying to show you is that this kind of work should be a priority for climate change. It is a response to climate change, to loss and damage, and it's a gender-just adaptation measure. So these kinds of approaches are also very important, and this is one way in which gender intersects with climate, but there are others, and we can share those examples later on. So with that, I'll pass it back to my colleague, Luam.
Venetia, do you want to go ahead to interpret first?
Yes. सो हमें एशली ने बताया कि कैसे नेपाल में उन्होंने बताया कि जब भी कोई जमीन आदिवासी कम्युनिटी, आदिवासी समाज उसका संरक्षण करता है, तो वो उसका एक्सप्लॉयटेशन नहीं करता है, बल्कि वो उसको संजो कर रखता है, और उसमें जब वो लोग उसका गवर्नेंस करते हैं, उनकी शासन प्रणाली करते हैं, उनको वो उसका मैनेजमेंट करते हैं, तो वो उससे अपना रोजगार भी कमाते हैं। तो इससे स्टैटिस्टिकली देखा गया है कि ऐसे समाज में, ऐसे देशों में करीबन 50% जो जमीन है फॉरेस्ट की, वो कम्युनिटी गवर्न करती है। और इससे नेपाल की केस स्टडी में पाया गया है कि 5% जमीन उल्टा बढ़ी है, रैदर देन जो हमारा एक दृष्टिकोण है कि अगर हम समाज को दे देंगे तो उसका एक्सप्लॉयटेशन होगा, बल्कि ऐसा नहीं हुआ है। 5% फॉरेस्ट लैंड बढ़ा है नेपाल में, क्योंकि वे लोग इसको अपना गवर्नेंस के लिए देख रहे थे और अपना लाइवलीहुड भी इसी से जनरेट कर रहे थे। तो जब भी हम जलवायु नीति के बारे में बात करते हैं, तो आदिवासी समाज के अधिकारों की रक्षा भी उन नीतियों में करनी चाहिए, ऐसा नेपाल की केस स्टडी में हमने देखा। अब हम अगर दीवा में आए, दीवा का एक प्रोजेक्ट चलता है फिजी में। फिजी एक आइलैंड राष्ट्र है, और ये जेंडर और क्लाइमेट की इंटरसेक्शनैलिटी पे काम करते हैं। अब इस पर कैसे काम करते हैं, तो फिजी भी हमारे भारत या अन्य साउथ एशियन देशों की तरह एक पितृसत्तात्मक समाज है, और यहाँ पे उन्होंने जो लेस्बियन, बाइसेक्सुअल और ट्रांसजेंडर या फिर जेंडर नॉन कन्फर्मिंग महिलाएं हैं, वो इस प्रोग्राम का नेतृत्व करती हैं। ये ऐसी फ्रंटलाइन कार्यकर्ताओं में या हमारे आम समाज में अगर आप देखें तो ये काफी वल्नरेबल ग्रुप है। पहले ही महिलाएं बहुत जगहों पे पिछड़ी हुई हैं, इसमें भी आप ये जेंडर नॉन कन्फर्मिंग ग्रुप को देख लेंगे तो ये और भी ज्यादा वल्नरेबल है। अब क्योंकि आंकड़ों में देखा गया है कि 62% ऑफ दिस ग्रुप, इस ग्रुप का 62% जो है वो कोई भी काम नहीं कर रहा है, वो वर्कफोर्स में नहीं है हमारे। तो अब ये लोग क्या करते हैं, ये लोग दीवा प्रोजेक्ट में एक ऐसी इंडस्ट्री जो कि ज्यादातर पुरुष प्रधान इंडस्ट्री है बिल्डर्स की, उसमें ये सर्टिफाइड बिल्डर्स हैं। इन्होंने सेतु बनाए हैं, सुरक्षित घर बनाए हैं, और शौचालय बनाए हैं, और अन्य बौद्धिक इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर्स खड़े कर रहे हैं, जो कि क्लाइमेट संबंधित प्राकृतिक आपदाओं का सामना करते हुए समाज को सुरक्षा देता है और उनके लिए काम करता है। तो इस तरह से ये जेंडर जस्टिस और क्लाइमेट जस्टिस पे काम करते हैं। तो जब भी हम जलवायु नीतियों की बात करते हैं तो इस तरह का दृष्टिकोण रखना कि किस तरह की समस्याओं में कैसे समाधान की जरूरत है, और इस तरह के इंटरसेक्शनैलिटी वाले दृष्टिकोण को रखना बहुत उपयोगी माना गया है। और हमारा जो भी नारीवाद या फेमिनिस्ट आंदोलन एक क्लाइमेट सॉल्यूशन की तरफ बढ़ता कदम ही है। ऐसी केस स्टडी हमें इस तरह के उदाहरण और देती है। थैंक यू एशली।
Thank you, Venetia. So we're going to switch into a bit around climate finance to give you a sense of what it is, but also what are the trends? What are we seeing in terms of where the money is going? So let's first start, if we can go back to the previous slide, please. Let's first start by defining what we mean when we're saying climate finance. So the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change refers to climate finance as local, national, or transnational financing drawn from public, private, and alternative sources of financing that seeks to support mitigation and adaptation actions that will address climate change. Next slide, please. So now that we have a sense of that, let's set the scene a little bit more. Based on an article by Jayati Ghosh, Shuvik Chakraborty, and Debamanu Desatimet, we know that fossil fuel subsidies totaled 5.9 trillion in 2020. And as if that isn't already a huge number, research from the World Resource Institute shows that, quote, between January 2020 and August 2022, the 38 largest economies and 8 multilateral development banks committed 515 billion in new financing to fossil fuel intensive sectors, compared to 488 billion to the clean energy sector. And international development funders committed more than 45 billion between 2015 and 2021 to projects that will prolong the use of fossil fuels, according to data from ClimateWorks. According to recent estimates, the total amount of funding needed for a global transition is between 4.9 to 9 trillion USD a year. In 2021, the total funding from individual donors and institutional donors was approximately 810 billion US dollars, with about 7.5 billion to 12.5 billion going to climate change mitigation, or in other words, please change slide, less than 2% of philanthropic dollars are going to climate mitigation. Clean energy, the clean electricity remains still the largest sector for philanthropic funding, but there's also, based on data from 2021 and 2022, an increase of resource flows to forests and carbon dioxide removal, though most of this, unfortunately, is still supporting false solutions, which I mentioned what false solutions are in the first section that we presented to you. Please change slide. So what I've just mentioned is overall philanthropic funding trends, but if we look to data from the Human Rights Funders Network, Ariadne and Candid from 2019, which is the latest analysis available at the moment, about 4.1 billion USD went to human rights funding more globally. And of that 4.1 billion USD, 11%, or 467 million, went to environmental and resource rights. Of that 11%, only 18% went to Indigenous peoples, or to say it another way, in total, only 84 million USD went to resource Indigenous peoples working on environmental and resource rights. Given the scale of the climate crisis, to say that this is not nearly enough would be a massive understatement. So as you can see from the data that I've shared with you, there needs to be a rapid increase, both from the public sector financing, but also philanthropic giving to climate change mitigation through a climate justice lens, while at the same time, a rapid defunding, including the stopping of subsidies for fossil fuels. When we think of philanthropic infrastructure funding flows, most of these are still going to the United States, to Canada, and also to Europe. Given the climate debt owed to communities across the Global South, and also that the Global South is most impacted by the climate crisis, this also needs to shift. One of the ways to do this is to support regional philanthropic infrastructure, because from what we're seeing from early data is that when funding moves from Global South-based philanthropy, 93% of that funding stays in the region. So funding going to climate justice work led across the global South is critical because, like we mentioned, Indigenous, Black, Afro-descendant, and caste-oppressed communities are advancing proven, holistic, and integrated solutions. And then again, to ground us in examples of these exciting climate justice work that needs to be resourced, I'll hand it back to you, Ashlesha, but first to you, Venetia, so that you can interpret that section.
Yes. So अगर देखा जाए जनवरी 2020 और अगस्त 2022 के बीच में 5.9 ट्रिलियन यूएसडी प्रॉमिस किया गया था कि ये हम क्लाइमेट जस्टिस के लिए देंगे, जिसमें से देखा गया है कि सिर्फ 810 बिलियन यूएस डॉलर्स जो हैं ये सिर्फ इंडिविजुअल लोगों ने रेज किया है इतना फंड। अब अगर देखा जाए कि सवाल ये है कि पूरा जो क्लाइमेट फाइनेंसिंग है ये वर्तमान में जा कहाँ रहा है, अधिकांश जलवायु जो वित्त है इसके प्राप्तकर्ता कौन है? तो इसके प्राप्तकर्ता लुआम ने बताया कि ये ज्यादातर यूएस, कनाडा जैसे डेवलप्ड कंट्रीज ही हैं, जबकि सबसे ज्यादा जरूरत, जैसा कि हमने देखा, ग्लोबल साउथ कंट्रीज को है। और जब हमने ये देखा कि जरूरत भी वहां ज्यादा है, और हमने इन केस स्टडीज में भी देखा कि जब आप उनको संसाधन देते हैं या उनको इस तरह की फंडिंग अपॉर्चुनिटी देते हैं तो वो ज्यादा ज्यादा यूजफुल होता है। तो अब ये कैसे किया जाए? इस तरह के सिस्टम चेंज जो हमने अभी ऊपर क्लाइमेट जस्टिस की बात की कि कैसे हम बॉटम अप अप्रोच बना सकते हैं, लोगों को कैसे इंक्लूड कर सकते हैं। जब हम ऐसे सिस्टम्स और पॉलिसीज बनाएंगे और ऐसे इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर्स क्रिएट करेंगे, तभी जाकर हम इन फंड्स को उस तरफ, ग्लोबल साउथ की तरफ और कम्युनिटी अप्रोच की तरफ आकर्षित कर सकते हैं। और अभी जो स्लाइड है वो यही दिखा रहा है कि इतना सारा फंडिंग होने के बावजूद भी क्लाइमेट मिटिगेशन में सिर्फ 2% से कम ही फंड्स जाते हैं। ओवर टू यू, एशले।
So, thanks, Vanisha. So now, friends, I have two more examples for you. The first one is about agriculture and climate justice. So agrarian climate justice, because the two are quite interlinked, as you know. And this model comes to us from Thailand. And this is from a group called the Southern Peasants Federation of Thailand. So it's a cooperative of about 600 people. And the interesting thing here is that, and we see this in different parts of Asia, that the government owns a lot of land, and that is called publicly owned land. In India also, we have that kind of situation, other parts of Asia as well. And in Thailand, about 30% of the land is owned by the state. But, it's not always that just because the state owns it, that land is going to be used in a responsible or particularly from an ecologically responsible way. And usually what happens is that the government can give it out to private companies on long-term leases. And in the case of Thailand, that is quite common. The government gives it on concessions and long-term leases to corporations. And one of those is the palm oil industry. So the palm oil industry, as you know, creates huge kinds of green deserts, we call it. So that is, you've seen the dead orangutans, because no life can live in these kinds of green deserts. So that's a very rampant problem in countries like Thailand. But here's the thing, that the government will give it for a lease on maybe 20, 30 years. But after the lease ends, the companies, they keep on farming it illegally. And so it's the communities who have taken those companies to court and challenge them, because, if the government owns the land, the government always has a choice on what it wants to do with the land. It can also give the land to communities, to landless farmers, and support livelihoods and support climate as well. So, by taking them to court, it was a 13-year court battle, and they won. And these communities in SPFT, about 600 peoples have been farming that land, and they have created something called a community managed land management program. And it's really a brilliant program, because there are about 5 villages who have, let's say, 100 acres each, or so. and each family gets 4 acres of land for farming, and they get 0.4 acre of land for building a home. And each community is governing the land in their own way. So for example, some communities, they have said that we'll have agriculture lands, then we'll have some collective farms for the community, where we can do some market, and not just for food but also some sustainable products for income. Then there's residential lands. Then they have also designated some land for forest regeneration, and some for fodder and livestock, and finally some land for community use, like community center, a hospital, a school. So they created this community land management model, and the model has been so successful. The only condition they have for their members is that they have to grow it in an agroecological manner. So Luam already spoke about why agroecology is so important. And I just want to add that 50% of emissions, come from the food system, and 15% of all fossil fuels are used in agriculture. So agriculture is obviously a very key area for us to decouple food from fossil fuels. And in this case, these communities have been farming so many acres of land by moving it away from palm oil plantation to community-led agroecology, and they've created infrastructure for the communities. And the government of Thailand has also visited, and they have actually approved and said that we are going to give you usufruct, which means use rights. That government will continue to own the land, but the communities will have the use rights for a very long period of time. And so this is one more example that if you create land access for communities, and we have examples in other countries, including in India, if you create land access for communities and support them to implement these kinds of solutions, you will not only gain in the climate front, but you will also have lots of social gains, and that is also evident here. Next slide. And the final example I want to bring is this from Philippines. This is the Philippines Movement for Climate Justice. And here we can see a link between energy and climate justice. So just to share about the Philippines, and this is a problem in so many different Asian countries, that the countries have gone to the UNFCCC at the climate convention. They said that we are going to reduce greenhouse gases. And the Philippines also said that 75% of greenhouse gases will be reduced by 2030. However, what the people on the communities and movements found, that actually Philippines was expanding coal, and there was a coal boom going on in the country. And they were also expanding other fossil fuels called LNG, which now they are saying is a clean fossil fuel. But however, it's still a fossil fuel. So far from reducing it, they're actually expanding it. And we all know that, when a coal plant opens, when a coal mine opens, the impacts on communities are terrible. There's pollution, there's toxicity in the water, there's land grabs. I mean, in India, we have examples of lots of struggles going on over forests because of coal. And so, here is an example where this movement, this is PMCJ, is a national coalition of 150 organizations, including churches and, community organizations, many different types, who got together. They took the government and they took the financiers of the coal boom to court. And that was the World Bank's Finance Corporation, IFC. And they were actually going against their own policies, because they have environmental and social policies, and what they did in violation of their own policy was that they started bankrolling a coal boom in the Philippines. So because of that, they went to court and they won. And as a result of their efforts, the government issued a moratorium on all new coal plants. So they actually managed to close almost 23 coal plants. And they have not only been resisting the kind of bad direction in fossil fuel growth in the Philippines, they have also been creating solutions. So in this photo, this is a photo from Visayas, which is an island in the Philippines, and the local community institutions, the church, the schools have all got together, and they've said that, we want to have renewable energy for the community. Oftentimes we see that renewables is taking place, the transition to renewables may be taking place, but it's for EVs, etc. It's for elite consumption, not always for grassroots communities. And here the communities also have a right to energy. So there's something called energy justice, energy democracy. everyone should have energy. I mean, and even in India, you can see the cities have always energy. Rural areas don't have power for so many hours. So how can you ensure that the communities have access to energy, and that it is also clean energy, and that it is also governed and managed by the community? So they have started a project of doing different kinds of energy generation projects, including solar, etc. And this is what is an example of community-led and community-controlled energy justice and climate justice. So here the link is that, of course, what is the climate justice angle? The climate justice angle is, of course, they are stopping the fossil fuels, they are increasing renewable energy, but at the same time, they're giving rights to the communities, to frontline communities, to access energy and to play a role in the climate transition and energy transition. So with that, I will pass it on to Vanisha for translation.
Yes. So पहला केस स्टडी था सदर्न पेजेंट फेडरेशन ऑफ थाईलैंड। इसमें सारे जो हमारे बिना भूमि वाले किसान थे वो अग्रेरियन न्याय की बात करते हैं। बिना भूमि वाले किसान सदस्यों ने एक सामुदायिक भूमि प्रबंधन कार्यक्रम बनाया जिसमें प्रत्येक परिवार को खेती के लिए भूमि दी गई। अब ये भूमि आसानी से नहीं दी गई। इन लोगों ने जो पब्लिक लैंड था वो एक पाम ऑयल कंपनी के पास था और वो किराए पे इस भूमि को एग्रीकल्चर के लिए यूज कर रही थी, एग्रीकल्चरल एक्टिविटीज के लिए। इन्होंने 13 इयर्स का 13 साल का बहुत लंबा ट्रायल चलाया और फिर ये आखिर में केस जीते और फिर ये पब्लिक लैंड जो है इन फैमिलीज में डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हुआ और करीबन हर फैमिली को 4 एकड़ का जमीन मिला एग्रीकल्चर करने के लिए, फार्मिंग करने के लिए। और इस लैंड पे फिर इन किसानों ने एग्रो इकोलॉजी का अभ्यास ये लोग अभी कर रहे हैं। उन्होंने कई कोऑपरेटिव्स की भी स्थापना की। हमारे कई एनजीओ साथी हैं जो सिमिलर ऐसा कुछ काम करते हैं, तो इन्होंने भी वैसा ही कुछ किया, कोऑपरेटिव्स की स्थापना की और ये युवाओं और महिलाओं में लीडरशिप कैसे क्रिएट कर सके और गांव का शासन और मैनेजमेंट वो विमेन लीडर्स और वो यूथ लीडर्स करें, ऐसा इनकी योजना है और ये उसी दिशा में अभ्यास कर रहे हैं। इनका मॉडल कई वर्षों से न केवल पॉलिसी थिंक टैंक्स स्टडी कर रहे हैं, लेकिन कई अलग तरह के मूवमेंट लीडर्स, आंदोलन के लीडर्स, एक्टर्स, इनके द्वारा भी ऐसी केस स्टडीज का अध्ययन किया जाता है। अब क्लाइमेट जस्टिस एंगल को कैसे देखें, हमने जैसे पहले भी बात की कि कैसे कम्युनिटी के हाथ में इन फॉरेस्ट कंजर्वेशन या फिर लैंड कंजर्वेशन को दिया जाए ताकि वो ना केवल अपने समाज के न्याय के लिए बल्कि हर दृष्टिकोण से इस क्लाइमेट जस्टिस को देखते हैं और हमारे क्लाइमेट का और एनवायरनमेंट का संरक्षण करते हैं। दूसरी केस स्टडी इन्होंने फिलीपींस की बताई, फिलीपींस मूवमेंट। इसमें ये लोग एनर्जी की डेमोक्रेसी की बात कर रहे हैं कि कैसे एनर्जी के सेक्टर को डेमोक्रेटाइज किया जा सकता है और आम लोगों तक पहुंचाया जा सकता है। तो इन्होंने देखा कि इनके राज्य में बहुत फॉसिल फ्यूल यूज हो रहा है, उसका एक्सपेंडिचर बहुत बढ़ रहा है, ज्यादातर कोल का यूसेज हो रहा है। तो जो डिफरेंट इंस्टीट्यूशंस के लोग मिले, चर्च, स्कूल या जो लोकल इंस्टीट्यूशंस होते हैं किसी भी समाज के, वो सारे इकट्ठा हुए और उन्होंने कहा कि हमें इस चीज के लिए लड़ाई करनी है। वो वर्ल्ड बैंक फाइनेंस कॉर्पोरेशन के पास गए, उन्होंने केस लड़ा और वो जीते भी, जिसकी वजह से इन्होंने काफी कोल प्लांट्स को क्लोज करवाया। और इन्होंने कहा कि जो रेन्यूएबल सोर्सेज ऑफ एनर्जी है, अगर हम आमतौर पे देखें तो ये सिर्फ हम बड़ी बड़ी कंपनियों में देखते हैं या फिर बहुत अमीर संस्थाओं या समाज में देखते हैं कि वो लोग इलेक्ट्रिक व्हीकल्स यूज कर रहे हैं या फिर उनका रेन्यूएबल सोर्स ऑफ एनर्जी को लेके ज्यादा उनकी एक्सेसिबिलिटी है ना, वो ज्यादा आसानी से उन तक पहुंच सकते हैं या उस तरह की एनर्जी क्रिएट कर सकते हैं। तो इन्होंने कहा कि नहीं, जैसा हमने सत्र की शुरुआत में बात की थी कि कैसे एनर्जी को या एनवायरनमेंट को इस पर सबका अधिकार है, वैसे ही उन्होंने इस रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी में कहा कि इसको भी क्रिएट और यूज करने का अधिकार आम लोगों का भी है। और इससे इन्होंने एनर्जी डेमोक्रेसी के लिए फाइट किया। और ये भी एक बहुत बेहतरीन उदाहरण है जब भी हम क्लाइमेट जस्टिस की बात करते हैं। थैंक यू Ashlesha, over to you.
So now we have come to the end of our presentation, and I'll hand it over to you, Mayun.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, all of you, Luam, Ashlesha, and Manisha. We'll open the floor to questions. I think if anyone wants to unmute yourself and ask a question directly, you may do so. I think we already have a couple of questions on the chat box. Maybe in the meantime, we can address that. I think Mr. Anil Kumar had asked what are the challenges in scaling up some of these sustainable models. I think he asked you this during your gender and climate system slide.
I'm happy maybe to start this off, and then Ashlesha, you can add. I think there's a couple of different ways we can look at that question. One is that there's a couple of different ways to think about scale. I think oftentimes people think about scale as just an absolute numbers game. And in the work that we do, there's a lot more nuance to scale. And so there's scale in terms of how many people it reaches. And so in this case, for example, PMCJ that Ashlesha mentioned at the very end could be a really great example of that. But then there's also the scale in terms of depth, the long-standing community work that may impact in absolute numbers, smaller number of people, but that still has an influence and an importance in the community that may be precedent-setting, may act as a spark for different things. And Fekufon is one really important example. It's in Nepal, it's in one geographic locality, but the kind of work that's happening there is the kind of work that we need to be happening across different communities throughout the global south, but also the global north. And so though it's very specific to a certain community, if we're looking only at absolute numbers, we'd miss, for instance, the importance of that kind of example. Then, of course, there's also the influence that comes when you think about, or the scale that comes when you think about influence. So a lot of the members, the partners that are across the different regions that we work in, are part of a formation called La Via Campesina. I assume most people on the call are aware of them. And this is a network coalition of people that are of groups and activists and farmers, pastoralists, fisher folk, that range into 180 million people. And the influence that they've been able to have has been from direct action with communities that are advocating for food sovereignty, to reform of policy and introduction of global mechanisms to support the work of food sovereignty across the different regions. So it's in those ways, I think then there's a lot of different ways to support the scaling of certain solutions, but it's important to broaden how we think about scale. The other thing, given that this is a conversation about philanthropic resourcing, is that the kind of money, like I mentioned in the climate finance piece, that moves to support community-based solutions, grassroots solutions, solutions that we know, like I said, are integrated, they're proven, and they're holistic climate solutions, is far too little. And so one of the ways that people in philanthropy can really support the scaling of these types of solutions is to properly resource them. And what we mean when we say properly resource them is to resource them with core funding so that these groups are able to set the agenda and use the funding how they would like to use the funding, because they know best how to do it, and to provide funding also over the longer term. Change doesn't happen in 2 or 3 minutes or in one project. It happens over a long period of time and takes a variety of different pathways. So the longer term support is really important for that. Anything you'd want to add to that, Ashlesha?
No, that was great. I don't know if Manisha, you want to interpret now or after the Q&A?
Yes, I guess I will take
Go
each
ahead.
question.
Go ahead.
तो सवाल ये था कि ऐसे इंटरवेंशंस को स्केल करने के लिए किस चीज की जरूरत है या क्या करना चाहिए. जिसका जवाब लुआम ने दिया कि हमने जैसा फिलीपींस और नेपाल की केस स्टडीज में देखा, जहां पे लोग एकत्रित होकर एक बड़े सिस्टम को इन्फ्लुएंस कर रहे हैं और एक पॉलिसी नीतियों के लेवल पे चेंज आ रहा है, या फिर ऐसे ग्रुप्स दूसरे ग्रुप्स को इन्फ्लुएंस कर रहे हैं अपने कार्य के द्वारा। तो ये सारे ऐसे प्रोजेक्ट्स के उदाहरण हैं जो कि स्केलेबल हैं। उसमें उन्होंने कहा कि बहुत सारे ग्रुप एक्टिविस्ट और फार्मर्स हैं जो इन्फ्लुएंसर्स बन गए हैं, और 118 मिलियन पीपल जो है वो फूड सॉवरेनिटी के लिए बाकी लोगों को इन्फ्लुएंस कर रहे हैं। और ये बिल्कुल अपने पॉलिसी लेवल पे और अपने ग्रास रूट लेवल पे वो जो काम कर रहे हैं उसी से उन्होंने इन्फ्लुएंस किया है। फिर दूसरा इन्होंने उदाहरण दिया कि उदाहरण नहीं, इन्होंने बोला कि हम कैसे इसको इन्फ्लुएंस कर सकते हैं ऑल्सो, कि हम कैसे रिसोर्स एलोकेशन करें उस ग्रुप को या उस इंटरवेंशन को। तो फंडिंग अपॉर्चुनिटीज को प्रॉपरली एलोकेट करना ऐसे इंटरवेंशंस के लिए भी एक दूसरा उपाय है, और बहुत बड़ा और लॉन्ग टर्म उपाय है, सस्टेन्ड अप्रोच है क्लाइमेट जस्टिस के डायरेक्शन में।
Great, and I'm seeing two questions for Fecophone here, so I'll combine those two. The first question is, what kind of support did the communities require in the Fecophone example? And finally, how has the Nepal government supported Fecophone? So absolutely, the Nepali government has actually supported Fecophone a lot, because the creation of Fecophone was done based on their constitution. Just as in India, for example, we have Gram Sabhas, that is a kind of decentralized governance model that we're starting from the village to the federal level, to the state level, to the federal level. So in the case of forests in Nepal, it's a entity, the forest user groups are now recognized in the constitution. So the government has endorsed it for sure. And also the government is envisioning that in the future, they want 60% of the forests to be governed by community forestry, because they've seen the encouraging results. So the kind of support that, although the government has said this, the forest user groups needed a lot of support. So coming to the support question, they have to fulfill regulations, even the formation, and many of you are from India, you understand, to create a Gram Sabha, you need to know the paperwork, you need to know bylaws, etc., etc. So even in the case of Nepal, they had to support them, to create group bylaws, to understand what management means, to create, decision-making structures, to create plans of how they're going to use the forests, and what kind of cooperative they want to create. So especially for women, how to engage in leadership positions, how women can play a frontline role in all of these decisions. So they've needed a lot of support. And that's why Fecophone was created as a federation, all the user groups, and they have been playing that supportive role. And I encourage all of you to read about them. You will find a lot of material about them online. And you can see how they've grown from being, to one of the biggest examples of community conservation in the world. So, Vanisha.
Yes. तो यहाँ पे सवाल था कि फेकोफोन जो कम्युनिटी है उनको कैसे सपोर्ट मिला और गवर्नमेंट ने उनकी हेल्प कैसे की। तो इसका आंसर था कि जैसे हमारे भारत में ग्राम सभा जैसी एक स्ट्रक्चर है जो कि हमारी सरकार ने रिकॉग्नाइज किया है, प्रॉपरली डॉक्यूमेंटेड है, हमारे रोल्स एंड रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज वहां पे लिखे हुए हैं, वैसा ही कुछ नेपाली गवर्नमेंट भी कर रही है, जिन्होंने ऐसी कम्युनिटीज को रिकॉग्नाइज किया, अपने गवर्नमेंट पॉलिसी स्ट्रक्चर का पार्ट बनाया। अब उनका उद्देश्य है कि कैसे इसको एक सभा के तौर पे पहचान दी जाए, अलग अलग लेवल पे, प्लेटफॉर्म्स पे ऐसी सभाओं को इंडोर्स किया जाए, और नेपाल का 60% जो फॉरेस्ट लैंड है वो ऐसे कम्युनिटी फॉरेस्ट्री से ही मैनेज किया जाए। अब इसके लिए वो लोग कई तरह के नियम बनाएंगे, लॉज बना रहे हैं, डिसीजन मेकिंग स्ट्रक्चर्स में ऐसे लोगों को इंक्लूड कर रहे हैं, समुदाय के लोगों को प्लान्स बना रहे हैं और प्लानिंग में भी उन लोगों को इंक्लूड कर रहे हैं, स्ट्रक्चर्स बना रहे हैं, और हर लेवल पे, हर पॉलिसी लेवल पे या स्ट्रक्चरल लेवल पे कैसे समुदाय के लोगों को इंक्लूड किया जाए, ये उनका अभ्यास है।
Thank you, Manisha. I think we're running short of time, so we'll just take one more question. I think we can just sum up two questions here. One is by Kriti saying, as an individual, how do we contribute to climate justice? And Raj's question on tips and resources for advocacy on climate justice. So we could just sum that up and and close.
I've put in for the tips on supporting with advocacy, I've put in the chat 2 reports, Solutions That Transform and Climate Solutions That Work, which have a lot of data and also examples that you can use, and feel free. That was done by Klima. We created it to answer this question specifically. And then I think the other piece of how as an individual can you get involved, for me, and answering as an individual who's also within an institution, it's to get involved with your community organizing, figuring out what is it that is needed in terms of what's around you, figuring out how to support movements that are fighting for that systems change, getting clear on what your contribution can be. But then also, as somebody who works in either a climate organization or works within a philanthropic organization, I understand that there's a mix here, is to make sure that you're understanding why grassroots climate solutions are really important, but also ensuring that it's the voices of the social movements that are setting your agenda. So your agenda should be a reflection of the agenda of social movements and the climate solutions that they're forwarding. And as much as possible, make room for social movements to come in and make the arguments and to show the work that they're doing themselves. And the best way for you is to move the kind of resourcing and the financing in ways that are least bureaucratic, so that movements can also really be resourced to do the systems change work that they're doing.
तो एक सवाल था कि कैसे आमजन ऐसे मूवमेंट्स में इन्वॉल्व हो सकते हैं, जिसमें लुआम ने कहा कि आपके लोकल एरिया में जो भी मूवमेंट्स चल रहे हैं या जिस तरह के भी क्लाइमेट जस्टिस के कार्य चल रहे हैं ग्रास रूट लेवल पे, प्लीज उसका भागीदारी बने, उनमें जाके भाग लें। और अगर आप किसी फिलैंथ्रोपिक इंस्टीट्यूशन या फिर क्लाइमेट जस्टिस इंस्टीट्यूशन के पार्ट हैं, तो फिर ऐसे मूवमेंट्स को हाईलाइट करें अपने प्लेटफॉर्म में, ताकि ज्यादा से ज्यादा लोग तक उनकी आवाज पहुंचे, ज्यादा से ज्यादा लोग उनके पार्ट बने। और अगर आपके पास ऐसी फंडिंग अपॉर्चुनिटीज आती हैं जो या रिसोर्स एलोकेशन की अपॉर्चुनिटीज आती हैं जो इनको और सपोर्ट कर सकती हैं, तो प्लीज इनकी दिशा में उनको मोड़े। तो अगर आप थोड़े डिसीजन मेकिंग वाले रोल में हैं तो प्लीज ऐसा कुछ कार्य करें, हाईलाइटिंग का और डायरेक्टिंग का। अगर आप एक इंडिविजुअल हैं तो प्लीज ऐसे मूवमेंट्स में खुद भागीदारी लें।
Thank you, Manisha. I think we've come to the end of the session. Thank you, Luam and Ashlesha, for your time and hosting this very informative session and answering all the questions of the participants. I hope it was the entire session was helpful for all of you in the audience. Please feel free to share your feedback with us or suggestions with us on the chat box, or reach out to any of us on LinkedIn or Instagram or anything else. Thank you all again very much for attending this, and hope you all have a great night ahead. Thank you.